Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for the invitation, and especially I have to thank Dr. Peischl, a very inspiring question from last year. His question was, could authoritarian systems be more capable of strategy than Western pluralistic societies? And we had a running discussion per email with him about this problem, and I sternly opposed the implication of his question, namely, it is possible at all. And my answer is no. And it's not because there are factual circumstances that determines dictators in a way, psychological circumstances, geological, historical, cultural circumstances, that determines the dictator in a way that they cannot make better decisions, or they usually make serious blunders in strategic decisions or in general in social decisions. But it's necessarily so. It is necessarily so. It flows from the, or it derives from the structure of knowledge and the structure of dictatorship. So they are not compatible. That's the simple argument I'm putting forward. It is important that this presentation was written 1 year ago, without Putin in Ukraine, without many other developments in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So it is really interesting for a philosopher that you can have empirical feedback from your theoretical position. Immediate empirical feedback, not historical empirical feedback. Of course, you can have historical or case studies, historical feedback or case studies always at hand. So, my thesis in brief, or my argument in brief, is that dictators are aiming for absolute power. By absolute power, I mean reserving the right to decide on anything according to his or her will. And I'm not going to use this gender-neutral expression anymore, because in history I do not know any dictator, female dictator. It might be a historical accident, but I think it's more than a historical accident. And it has serious consequences that we should leave our government mostly to women rather than men. But it's not part of my talk. The aims of a dictator and the structures by which he can realize those aims are incompatible with the structures that can produce knowledge. That is necessary for the realization of the dictator's aim. So the dictator has certain aims. He needs certain knowledge in order to realize those aims. But the knowledge production system that could produce that sort of knowledge that he requires cannot produce the knowledge, because they are incompatible with the dictatorship itself. Therefore, no dictator can exercise and retain absolute power rationally. And that's the point here, rationally. Of course, they can maintain their power by force, by sheer force. Absolute power can be maintained only by force, and the decisions, especially strategic decisions, a dictator produces are necessarily suboptimal. So let me begin with some clarifications. Democracy exists when principal leaders of a political system are selected by competitive elections in which the bulk of the population has the opportunity to participate, therefore to influence decisions. And authoritarian systems are usually defined as the opposite of democratic systems. And competitive elections and the opportunity for masses to participate in decision-making and in election presuppose fairness and liberty. Therefore, democracy is by nature a liberal, pluralist democracy. So illiberal democracy cannot exist. Cannot exist in the sense that people participate in decision-making, participate in the election of their representatives. Unfortunately, there are many leaders who believe in illiberal democracies. Of course, not because they think this makes sense. This is a contradictio in adjecto. Nevertheless, they believe in because it pays off. That's good for their power. So dictatorship here in this lecture is an extreme form of autocracy in which the dictator vindicates absolute power on every decision. Absolute power, meaning here, he is the only one who has autonomy in making decisions, and everybody else's decision can be overruled by dictators. So it's not that the dictator is the only one who can make decision, who is allowed to make decision. Of course, he can delegate decisions to an assembly, to certain other persons, etc., etc. But whatever the case is, he can overrule those decisions by power. And that's the point. That's why he is the ultimate decision maker in this sense. If he chooses, then he can reshuffle the national football team because he thinks he knows better how to assemble a good football team than the coach. And just in brackets, authoritarian leaders tend towards this extreme because it usually is the only way how they can maintain their power and prevent rivalry. There are many arguments, surprisingly, for authoritarian rules, and we can hear nowadays quite a lot of them. There is an empirical consequentialist argument, or a type of arguments rather, saying that authoritarian rule produces more benefits like order, security, stability, prosperity, morality, etc., than democratic government can, especially in the case of emergency. So when we are in the case of emergency, we need strong rule. That's almost a platitude. That's almost a platitude. It's not the case, actually. It's not the case. There are other arguments, also I do not tackle them, arguments based on ideologies, and qualitative, quantitative justification arguments from the contradictions of liberal democracies. The strategy of this kind of argumentation is that we spot the flows of liberal democracies and claim that autocracies can overcome those flows. There are arguments, interestingly, epistemological arguments from liberalism as well, and I would like to mention some of them in order to locate my argument in this framework, in this conceptual field. So, from Mill on, probably from Locke on, many philosophers argue that liberal democracies are superior over autocracies of any form because of epistemological reasons, because of the knowledge that can be produced by the society. And one of these arguments is no one individual or body can possess the knowledge of all people and foresee the consequences of his or her action. So it's essentially an argument from the limitation of human knowledge. For the same reason, we need free market and the rule of law, and a most prominent advocate of this kind of argument is Hayek, of course, and Popper. The second argument for liberalism, epistemological argument for liberalism, is that collective participation and liberty are necessary to find truth and what good is. Truth can be found only in free and unconstrained discussion, because knowing is essentially a social enterprise. This argument originates from Mill on liberty. You should note that this argument is strong enough only if you assume that we have these values. We want to have truth and we want to have good. If you don't care about truth, then this argument doesn't matter. And most of the dictators of our days don't care about truth. They simply ignore truth and say, so what? Probably the most prominent representative of this position was Mr. Trump. And finally, the third argument for liberalism is certain types of knowledge can be known only by individuals because they have privileged access and can be brought into the domain of social knowledge only when they got to know it and when they provide us with this kind of knowledge. Again, this is the central argument of Hayek. People themselves know what they need, what they want, and therefore free market is indispensable as a sort of information market. Notice again, this is a value-based argument. It matters only if you want to know what people want. If you don't want to know, if it's not a value for you as the ruler of the society, then who cares about what they know? No one cares about it. Okay, so let me contrast my approach to all the approaches I mentioned. So epistemological defenders of liberalism present value-based arguments for it, saying it is better because, and all these after the because rests on the values, the common values we suppose everyone shares. Okay, but if it's not the case, and it is not the case in dictatorship, therefore these arguments are useless against dictatorships because they don't care about these values. So you cannot derive your argument from the presupposition of those values because they don't care about them. Therefore, I take another way. The opposite of liberalism is dictatorship, the other end of the scale. I argue against dictatorship by virtue of its drawbacks without any reference to common values. So I will discuss values, but only those values that derive from the dictatorship itself, the nature of the dictatorship itself, the definition of the dictatorship itself. So a dictator, by definition, absolute power aiming dictator. So dictator defined by dictator aims at absolute power. So a dictator, by definition, wants to exercise and retain his full sovereignty, absolute power. Therefore, he needs to know how to do this. Unless he knows how to run a country by absolute power, he cannot do that. Sound knowledge and truths are necessary for successful dictatorship. And I'm talking about rational dictatorship, of course. Now, we have to have some epistemological considerations in order to develop the other side, the epistemological side of the problem. So, dictators need knowledge. That's that's quite simple. Now we have some assumptions and some considerations about knowledge. First of all, a metaphysical assumption, not about knowledge, but about the nature of reality. This is part of my argument, so if it fails, then my argument fails as well. So reality, physical and social alike, is at least partly independent of autocrats. So there is something that is at least partly independent of us, even of the most independent of the most powerful people. Therefore, truth and knowledge cannot be only power. Unlike Foucault's position, it presupposes that there is some harshness of reality that can resist our efforts, whatever we believe, whatever we devise culturally, whatever power we have. Knowledge and truth is partly independent of what the dictator wants to be true. So it's not a simple voluntarism. That's all what I need, all what my argument needs. So the other side is about the epistemology, how knowledge is produced. And my assumption is epistemology is basically a social phenomenon. Knowing is a social enterprise. Individuals, dictators included, by themselves can achieve only very limited knowledge, very, very limited. So there is no Robinson Crusoe kind of knowledge that can accumulate knowledge infinitely, provided that he can live on indefinitely. So very limited knowledge, that is not enough to exercise absolute power over complex social systems. And then some more assumptions about the social production of knowledge. If we accept that knowledge is by nature a socially produced phenomenon, then we should also accept some of its consequences. So any form of knowing, not just science, requires freedom and autonomy in a social sense for the knowing individuals and community. Because knower and knowing should be governed by its own epistemological rules and by its subject matter. So if you want to know reality, then your knowledge, your process of knowing reality, getting to know reality, should be governed two factors: reality itself and the process and methodology that you use to find out what reality is. Freedom of thought and speech are necessary for the discovery of truth in social knowing, in the social process of knowing. For example, critical discussion of proposals is necessary. Unless you have critical discussions, you cannot have knowledge. The third one is restriction of cognitive initiatives. Cooperation hampers social knowing. So, for example, some form of freedom of assembly and action is necessary to free these sort of discussion groups, to organize these sort of conferences, to organize academic research groups, etc., etc. They are all indispensable for reliable knowledge, if knowledge is a social enterprise, given that knowledge is a social enterprise. So what we see here is that knowledge as a social enterprise requires some sort of freedom, and definitely knowledge production definitely requires autonomous decision-making on research and on the acceptance of research. So the conditions of knowing are incompatible with the exercise of absolute power. Therefore, in a perfect dictatorship, dictators cannot acquire the knowledge they need, or they do not have the absolute power over knowledge production. So if my argument is sound, then it shows only that sufficient knowing is impossible if a dictator controls and directs everything, including the process of knowing, process of knowledge gathering, production. If he is the only autonomous person in social decision-making. And indeed, we used to have these sort of dictators. We used to have, in the communist bloc, these sort of dictators. The great man, the party boss, went to the production site and gave directions on the spot. They called it on-the-spot directives of Nicolae Ceausescu. On-the-spot directives of Mátyás Rákosi, the Hungarian ruler, and the Romanian ruler, Nicolae Ceausescu. They went to the field and told the peasants, you should do this and that will be better to produce corn, say. Absurdity. It was reported in the news. It had media coverage always. And the same is true for the nowadays dictators, as Mr. Trump suggested how to cure COVID by certain detergents and chlorines. That was absurd. Okay, so it doesn't work. It obviously doesn't work. You don't need any more argument for this. Let me go a step further. What if dictators are more rational than those dictators I mentioned? So what if we are facing with an imperfect dictatorship? Imperfect in a very special technical sense that is not fully comprehensive. That is, a rational dictator may want to trade in some power for knowledge. Okay, I do not control knowledge production. You give me knowledge by which I can control the rest of the society. That would be a rational way of handling this problem. This would be the imperfect dictatorship in the sense it is not the dictator that is imperfect, but it is not fully comprehensive. This rational dictator wouldn't want to control every aspect, every social domain, every aspect of life, every social domain. So he would like to give room for knowledge production and then use this knowledge in order to control the rest of the society. So suppose he relinquishes his sovereignty over part of the knowledge production by giving freedom to knowers. Thus, part of the knowledge production is governed differently from the rest of the society. I leave you alone, I give you freedom, I give you the necessary liberties, you produce knowledge, and I use this knowledge to oppress the rest of the society. So what are the problems with this imperfect dictatorship? The possibility of a rationally self-restrained dictator gives rise to three serious questions. One, is it possible to delineate and treat differently the social domain that needs freedom in order to provide the necessary knowledge for me by which I can oppress the rest of the society? he, the dictator, know that this domain, what this domain is, what knowledge he needs in order to exercise his absolute power on the rest of social domains? How could he know? It is a serious epistemological problem. So you should first know what you need. Before you know, you should first know what you need in order to use for particular purposes. But how can you know that if you don't know it already? It's a kind of Platonic problem you should solve before you can do this. Even if he does not direct his social domain, I mean the knowledge production domain, how can he control it? Because he needs control over knowledge production to prevent any possible threat to his power. He needs social control over knowledge production because otherwise his personal dictatorship will be threatened by those domains. And finally, can dictators accept truths that contradict what he wants or what he believes? That is, can he respect and acknowledge the sovereignty of truth over his own knowledge and sovereignty? Okay. It means that you submit to knowledge and accept the power of knowledge over your own wills and wishes. So the first question is whether you can localize the knowledge what you need in order to maintain absolute power before you know all those pieces of knowledge. So a self-restrained dictator must be liberal in knowledge production in order to be a proper dictator as well. Diverse and vast amount of knowledge is needed to rule a society. Virtually, and that was the argument from Mill, virtual knowledge from every aspect of society is necessary here. And this knowledge hardly can be produced by localizable social institutions or a circle of individuals. Many branches of science and profession, from posters to military intelligence, are necessary. And the freedom of military intelligence is necessary in order to produce knowledge. Therefore, military intelligence should be run differently from the rest of the society where dictator exercises absolute power. You see? So, virtually most of the society is necessary to produce this kind of knowledge. And you can remember Hayek's argument about the distributed knowledge in the market, I mentioned earlier, that is necessary in order to run the economy. Thus, even if the dictator would be restrained, he could not rule as a rational dictator because the society should be tightly ruled by the same society, or most of the same society, as the source of knowledge for this tight rule should be liberally and democratically governed. So that's the problem here. That's the problem. The scale of the knowledge that is necessary to maintain absolute power on a substantial domain of society. So preventing threat coming from knowledge production. How can he prevent threat coming from knowledge production? And you should remember, dictators are always frightened even by the thought of a university. Universities are always considered as a great threat to dictatorships, to autocracies, and other institutions as well. So even if the production of necessary knowledge could be localized, it cannot be localized. But even if it could be, it's a counterfactual hypothesis here, and treated liberally, separately from the rest of the society. Dictator could not afford to let this autonomous knowledge production part of the society threaten his power, to let knowledge production be as an incubator of uprising against him. He cannot let this happen. He can make sure no threat emerges from knowledge production by appointing loyal people to these institutions. And that's the way how dictators operate. They appoint loyal people to knowledge production institutions. He can trust them because he can trust them, and therefore can give them autonomy. However, this again is a deviation from the logic of knowing. For obviously, the best knower can best produce knowledge. The best knower can best produce knowledge, and not the most loyal ones. Additional problem emerges with assigning the task of knowing to loyal people is that it entails that the outcome will be distorted, and necessarily so. Because if I am loyal to the dictator, I share his views, then how can I trigger truth that contradicts those views? Since loyal people are as such positively prejudiced toward the dictator, his ideology and his dictatorship, it is hardly the right mindset for finding truth, of course. That's a platitude. The institutional power problem is the third one. If your primary aim is to prevent political challenge from the knowledge production institutes, then structure and management of the institutions will be set accordingly, and they are set accordingly in dictatorships. However, such management is not the best fit for the knowledge production. It can even block knowledge production, and we see that in Hungary right now. All in all, the knowing process is at least threefold distorted by loyal knowledge producers. Therefore, one can hardly expect reliable knowledge and truth from the delegation of knowledge production to loyal people. And can dictators submit to truth when it crosses his will and thwart his power? Yes, I do. I think here is a hard dilemma for him. If yes, then he should relinquish his sovereignty not only over knowledge production, but also over many other social domains, because other social domains behave differently from what he thinks and believes they should behave. If not, then truth and knowledge remains limited to what he happened to know as an individual. His limited self-restraint over knowledge production in order to retain absolute power elsewhere is hardly successful in either case. So, conclusion for imperfect dictatorship: when the dictator approaches society in a way to let knowledge be produced as it should be produced, and use this knowledge that is necessary to be used for the oppression of the rest of the society. So the strategy to swap part of his power for the knowledge that is necessary to exercise absolute power in other social domains does not work. Either the dictator must give up absolute power, or he cannot get the knowledge what he needs to have. And it is the most basic point here. And usually dictators do not give up absolute power, so they have to give up knowledge. It seems that even a self-restrained dictator cannot secure the reliable knowledge that is necessary to rationally preserve and exercise absolute power over most of the society. So my argument doesn't say that no rational decision can be made by a dictator. They can make rational decisions. They can make empirically justified and rationally executed decisions on particular small, restricted cases. So they can make local decisions very well, but not the absolute. They cannot make the decisions that are required by absolute power over society. So rational dictator, well-founded decision virtually on any particular issue, but not on the whole scale of absolute power. And other qualification, and that's again very interesting. A dictator may come into power with a lot of knowledge accumulated in society. And he can use this knowledge during the first period of his dictatorship. And then, of course, he can make even good decisions in his terms, according to his wills, according to his aims, good and rational decisions to maintain absolute power. But then this knowledge gets obsoleted, and he gets in a position where he has no accurate, up-to-date knowledge anymore. So it is part of the explanation why dictatorships gradually detach themselves from reality and truth. The longer he remains in power, the bigger the risk of making unfounded decisions is, because of this essential tension. Consequently, dictators tend to rely more and more on terror to maintain their power, instead of rational decisions to maintain their power. Stalin was a good example in case. He was a brilliant mind, how to use terror as a simple tool to maintain his absolute power. But it was not a rational dictatorship, and it has consequences as it had. So it is the only model of dictatorship. There is no other model, because there can be no other source of dictatorship, because the only other source that could be is knowledge, and knowledge is not accessible to dictators. So there is an essential tension between absolute power and truth, sound knowledge. There is an essential tension between holding and exercising absolute power and acquiring the necessary knowledge for holding and exercising absolute power. So what is my conclusion to the question raised by Paschal? Therefore, a dictator necessarily deprives himself from the knowledge and truths that are necessary for him to rationally exercise and retain absolute power on any significant social domain in a historical period, strategy included. And I think the best case in example best example here is you should remember Putin's hearing or collective decision-making over the recognition of the Donbass self-proclaimed states. And you remember how he chased into the corner and mocked his own chief of intelligence. The chief of intelligence wanted to warn against this decision, and he simply humiliated that man. So that is a sort of example that embodies the problem, that exemplifies the problem in its depth. So there can be no reliable source of knowledge for a dictator, because it's an existential threat for all those who wants to feed back to the dictator. And this is not because the dictator is selfish, is so ruthless, or because the dictator psychological setup prevents this. It's not. It's because the dictatorship, the logic of dictatorship itself, prevents the production of reliable knowledge, prevents the production of reliable strategy. And that's the only hope I have. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much indeed for this more than interesting lecture, and also for the deconstruction of the strongman myth. Fragen vom Auditorium? Hier. Sammy, kommst du vor?
I fully agree to what you say, of course. given the quality of knowledge or non-knowledge that the dictator can provide. Perhaps may I add an argument which may help you from the more formal point of view, as a historian, not as a philosopher, because I'm a historian. If we ask ourselves what the dictator actually can provide in terms of formal qualities of his decision-making, then what his decisions show is that they are fast, that is the speed of their decisions, and secondly, the unambiguity of these decisions. But speed and unambiguity are not characteristics of strategic decisions, but of tactical or operative decisions. So normally you get a dictator to solve operative problems, and the Romans normally, the normal Roman dictatorship was half a year. And once the dictator was appointed, matters of strategy had already been decided. So the dictator is by its very essence not a strategist, but at the maximum he is an operator. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very good point. I should emphasize this is so when it comes to the question that the dictators or strong man is necessary in case of emergency, it's always quoted as an argument that yes, we need a strong man because of the fast decision-making process and because of the clear-cut, very straightforward decisions they make. Look, none of them are characteristics of good decisions. They are features of decisions that can be expedient in social use. But it's quite different from the problem whether this decision is sound or good or optimal or the best possible under certain circumstances. And these characteristics has nothing to do with good decision. You know, it is just two characteristics of useful decisions. Useful decisions that comes in time and you can act on. These are useful characteristics of a decision. But these are not the primary characteristic or the quality of the decision. This has nothing to do with the quality. Sometimes the best decisions are the more ambiguous decision because it can leave up to you what to do on the spot instead of directing you to do this or that, ordering you to do this or that. It's much easier to follow this later kind of decision, but the former kind can be much better because it takes all the possibilities, unforeseen events into account and leaves you to decide what is the best on the spot. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I will come to you to discuss these points. Yeah, that's very interesting. Historian perspective is very interesting always.
Thanks, Professor. Eine weitere Frage?
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. What is a pity, referring to Putin and how to say the rise to power? He took certain decisions when he became prime minister, for example, to pay rents.
Pardon me?
To pay rents. And ordinary people not living, what is it, in towns like St. Petersburg, they were over-enthusiastic. Let's say he fixed one, what is a thorny issue. But then you referred, in order to, let's say, to take another view, Narishkin, what is the head of intelligence. He was not a counterweight because he was what is one of his buddies, let's say from St. Petersburg. That these people are not able, how do you say, to produce a kind of counterbalance. What is a pity if you follow his biography, and you of course know that better than I, let's say, what is a pity that we in the West from, for example, 2000, hopefully I'm correct, 6 or 7, when he said, okay, I can't be re-elected, therefore we find a different mechanism. And from that point of view, we should have been extremely careful and not always to refer to this argument here defended by a lot of people. He fixed the chaos left by Yeltsin. And therefore we have the constitution. but he make abuse. And then the latest, what you said, let's say, not giving people the possibility getting access to information by trying to control internet and so on. And that was already, how do you say, you could feel it already from 2000 onwards. Let's say that he tried to restrict access to certain internet sources. Afterwards it was a bit different, but let's say the majority had difficulties more and more to get access to certain knowledge sources. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good morning. Briefly, what would you say how the development of artificial intelligence will change this concept? Artificial intelligence is an alternative source of knowledge about the society. Could you imagine that the dictator... yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I'm not that worried about artificial intelligence because I do not see artificial intelligence. That's my prejudice. Just I want to put it on the table. I do not see artificial intelligence as one kind of autonomous intelligence and man as another kind of autonomous intelligence. I think artificial intelligence and human intelligence are cooperating. They are working together. Artificial intelligence are used, developed, directed, technically devised, etc., technically implemented, devised, etc., by humans, and the computational results, the decision made by artificial intelligence are carried out by humans, etc., etc. So human intelligence and artificial intelligence are really intertwined. And insofar as intelligence, artificial intelligence, is real intelligence, then the best possible feature that can account for this could be that how artificial intelligence can cooperate with human intelligence. For instance, what is it? Autonomous driving. Autonomous driving is a very good example. You use artificial intelligence in order to drive your car. But in order to drive your car, you have to cooperate with other drivers. Some are human, some are autonomous drivers. And you have to cooperate with traffic lights, with the instructions of police, etc., etc. So artificial intelligence, if it is intelligence, it is embedded in society, along ways with human intelligence, and cooperate with human intelligence. So I don't think this would refute my argument because of this social embeddedness of artificial intelligence. That's my view about artificial intelligence. It's not necessarily true. There are other views on artificial intelligence that do not treat artificial intelligence in this social terms or social embeddedness terms. Thank you so much. That's a surprise. That's a surprise. Thank you very much. Thank you.